All right. Hello, everybody. It looks like we are live. Joshua with ImpEx Beverages here with our first of our 2022 Drinks with series. Hopefully you all, well, those of you that are on Instagram at least, have been checking out the ImpEx Beverages Instagram series. We're basically running those for 3 months. And then we do these events here on YouTube and on Facebook, and then we'll do another 3 months of Instagram, and then we'll be back here and so on. So that's how the year is going to go. So hopefully you've been enjoying those Instagram events. And I'm excited for this one in that we can bring in more guests, which is good. So today's topic is going to be on barley. And we've got 3 distillery representatives, 3 distilleries that are in the ImpEx portfolio that actually produce whiskey from barley that they farm themselves. So I'm excited to have them on board, talk about their processes and their farming and how it influences their whiskey. So why don't I bring, well, you know what? First I'll bring on the venerable Mr. Sam Filmus. How are you, sir?
Fine. How are you?
I'm good. It looks like I caught you off guard.
Always.
Well, good to have you here. I'm gonna bring in your partner in crime here, Mr. Chris Udy. Oh, look at that! Your face is further away from the screen. Look at that. You're a little further back.
I'm even further. I mean, I'm halfway across the room at this point, though. My head is so big.
Further away he is, Joshua, it's better for everyone. Trust me on
This
this.
is very true. This is very true. Truer words have never been spoken. Then, Mr. James Wills from Kilchoman. I caught you off guard as well, sir.
Yeah, I thought you were going to have a little chat between yourselves, so I was just waiting in anticipation.
Yeah, I just wait until I can see everybody in the background, so I wait for them to look away. And when we least expect them, I call their name. Really excited to have you on, James. Especially Kilchoman being with us in our portfolio for so long, and have been the distillery we've been talking about, which has had the barley to bottle process. So we're gonna want to dig deep in there. I'm gonna bring another Scottish gentleman here, Mr. David Ferguson of Lochlea Distillery. How are you, sir?
I am good, thanks, Joshua. Yourself?
I'm good. Are you awake and ready to go?
Absolutely. I've been smashing the coffee all night, and I've got a whiskey now. So yeah, all good.
And then we've got David Thompson, Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery. How are you, sir?
Absolutely fantastic, thank you, for this time in the morning.
That's brilliant. Really, really happy to have you all. And we've got people chiming in here from Brooklyn, from California, a few other places around. Anyway, so thank you all again for coming. I'd sent you all a question ahead of time for you to mull over as we get into this conversation about barley. And as I mentioned before, all 3 of your distilleries are distilleries that pull barley from your own farms and use it in your production, which is quite rare. But interestingly enough, not so rare in the ImpEx portfolio, which is kind of cool, or at least now not so rare. So the question that I threw at you is barley, which has been the traditional grain for brewing and distilling for hundreds of years. When you think about how barley is discussed, brewers often mention the flavors coming from the barley. And granted, they'll use different barley varieties and sometimes different roasting levels and things like that. Whereas distillers often refer to barley as something that simply gets them yield of alcohol to produce their whiskey, right? And so I'm curious to know what your stance is on that idea and how it informs your farming practices, and then by extension, how it informs your production. And I'm going to call on the OG here, James Wills, to shed your light on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we're looking to maximize the flavor at every stage. So, at every part of the whiskey making process, we're looking to add flavor, and in many cases add specific flavors. So we look at distillation and fermentation, obviously maturation as well, and we're looking to maximize the flavors, and having control over the barley growing. That's another area that we can look at to maximize the flavor that we're getting into our whiskey. And from experience, we know that there is a difference particularly between we're talking about one farm on one island with Kilchoman. So when it comes to terroir, there is basically a single terroir in terms of the soil is the soil, but the flavor that we get between different barley varieties is very obvious, I think. Certainly at the spirit stage, when you're tasting it off the stills before it goes in the barrels. And so it absolutely informs what we do on the barley growing side. So we have grown in the past, I don't know, probably 8 or 10 different barley varieties over the last 10, 15 years, and each one has been slightly different. So we're looking to grow barley varieties that give the whiskey particularly or lean towards the sort of lighter, fruitier, floral kind of side. So for us, those are kind of Concerto has been our stable for the last 6 or 8 years. So yeah, it absolutely, barley variety plays a role, and we're looking to add that flavor as a result, definitely.
And I know that when you farm, you're usually farming 2 different varieties of barley in a singular year. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, Islay has probably more challenges when it comes to growing barley in terms of the environment that you're growing it in compared to, say, Yorkshire or the mainland of Scotland, even, because Islay has a uniquely hostile environment, particularly when it comes to wind and mainly wind. So yeah, we have to grow specific varieties that will actually grow on Islay. We can't just grow any barley variety that we like. So that plays a part in our selection, and so it's a balance between what will grow well and what will taste good. So yeah, we grow 2 varieties a year, and as I said, we've grown about 8 or 10 different varieties over the course of the last 15 years that we've been in production. And yeah, typically it's 2 a year.
Okay.
And that's usually because we're looking to kind of bring on and discover the next variety whilst also kind of growing the bulk of what we need now, if you know what I mean. So we've grown a little bit of Sassy over the last 2-3 years. This year we're growing predominantly Sassy, but then we're also growing a little bit of a relatively new variety called Planet, so that hopefully in time, we'll look at how that flavor comes through off the stills, and then in time that it might end up replacing Sassy.
Yeah. So I want to hand this question over to David Thompson, but really quickly before I do, a really apropos question came up from James, and hopefully I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, James DeGaio. And James wanted to know, do you ever mix more than one barley in a batch?
We have done. So it's only recently that, I think it was in 2019 that we actually, so it would have been our 2018 crop that was harvested separately and then distilled separately. So I'm talking about harvesting individual barley varieties, malting them individually, distilling them individually, maturing them individually. There's much more to it than just taking it off the field, in terms of individual barley varieties. So, but prior to 2018, we would grow multiple varieties, but they would all be malted and distilled, together effectively.
Okay. Oh, that's very cool. Thank you. So David Thompson, I realize we've got 2 Davids here. What are your thoughts on this about flavor, and how are you thinking about that as it pertains to your farming and your own production?
I agree very much with what James said about flavour is very much choice driven. How you ferment, how you malt the barley to start with, and then how you ferment, how you distill, and how you mature. I mean, these are choices you make for flavour reasons, and they're so varied, obviously. So I absolutely agree there. Our background is growing barley on the same farm for 70 years. We've had many varieties through the farm, but of course we're relatively new to do distilling. We've only been distilling since 2016. So I guess we've had 3 to 4 different varieties through the equipment, but very much coming from a farming, an agronomic background. Barley to us, we don't think drives a huge deal in terms of its variety, a huge deal of flavour through variety. Bearing in mind that spring barley is in the ground for very, very small amount of time, typically on the wolds 5 months. It's got a very short period of time to pick up any terroir in our view. Whereas, obviously the terroir comes from a grape background where the vine is in the ground for hundreds of years, and I get it. So we're going to be a little bit controversial, I think, on this one. We believe that barley as a variety doesn't actually add a great deal of flavour. All the flavour for us comes from process choice.
Oh, interesting. So the mashing, the fermenting, the distilling thereafter. Okay.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay. I have a follow-up question for you, but I think that this follow-up question will apply to all 3 of you. So I'm going to hold it back for a second. Actually, I've got 2 rattling around in my head. Let's see if my brain will hold these questions. David, with Lochlea, how much importance are you putting flavor onto your barley, or is it just a matter of yield for you, and you focus more on the process, much like David at Spirit of Yorkshire?
Yeah, so I agree with both of the guys in different ways. Actually, the Lochlea is, I mean, the thing that I suppose for us, the barley's all grown within 1.5 miles of the still house, so we are the only people that use Lochlea barley. So that, I mean, it is unique to us, whether or not it gives, whether or not it does give flavour. I think if you'd asked, if you and I had chatted about this, Joshua, 4 or 5 years ago, a bit more cynical back then, working for a bigger corporate company, I probably would have said no. But actually, since I've got so close to the process now, and even more so with John Campbell coming on board and taking us through every step and how, changing this makes this difference to the new make, and then you literally go over nose the new make and say, oh yeah, okay, that's that does actually happen. So I've now, I'm a convert on this. I really do think what we do does have an impact. There's certain things. I think David mentioned there about grapes, terroir. I think it's slightly different. I mean, cognac producers don't tend to talk about that sort of thing as much, whereas when I was over in Mexico recently, all the agave producers, or especially mezcal producers, they all talk about the altitude of the agave and how different that that impacts their final spirit, which
sure.
Again is going through the same very similar process. So I think we're a wee bit, as a whiskey part of the spirits category, we're slightly late to the game in talking about this, but it's good. I'm delighted that we are. So yeah, for me, I think our barley has an impact, and I think there's other things process wise that obviously determine the final flavor or range of flavors. One big thing for me is time in casks. So if you try a 3, 4, 5-year-old single malt from a distillery who uses their own barley, there's a fair chance you're going to get some flavor, some compounds coming through. If you try a 30-year-old single cask, it's probably unlikely that you're going to, because by that point the cask has the percentage wise. Don't ask me about percentages again, Joshua, because I'll disagree with myself in the same sense. But I think you can't. There are so many other things going on, and I think they all have a part to play. It's just, you would need an empirical study to determine just how much the barley is in comparison to all the other parts. Yeah,
right. And it's such a good point that you bring up. And this was a future question that I had, but I'll ask it here, and I'll hope too that David Thompson can come back on. It looks like his Wi-Fi kicked him off. But it is an interesting point where if you're looking to barley for its importance on flavor, and yet you're trying to keep a consistency of flavor within your own house style, at what point, at least to your palate, and now granted, James, you might have a deeper answer for this, just having been in production for so long by comparison to Lochlea, but how long does that nuance in flavor difference from barley variety to barley variety, how long does it last in cask before the cask kind of ages that nuance out?
Is that one for me?
Sure. Yes, it is. Do I need to repeat it?
No, sure. Yeah, so I think this is the crux of the whole thing, So I think where people can kind of get a little bit lost, where in whiskies and when we're talking about the production processes is kind of where they rank the different processes in terms of how they influence the flavor of the whiskey. So, right at the top there, you've got to have age and cask type. That's always going to be the dominating, factor in the way that a whiskey tastes.
Sure.
Regardless of the distillery, wherever it is in the world, the cask type and the age is always going to be the biggest influencer on the flavor. And then behind that, you've got the stills, the fermentation, the peating level, certainly the peating level, if it's a peated whiskey. Those are all things that are way up over and above barley variety in terms of the influence on the flavor. Barley variety in terms of, what you end up whiskey in the glass and tasting. The variety of barley is right down the list in terms of, the influence it's had on the way that whiskey tastes. And I think that that's the crux of the whole kind of debate, is it worthwhile growing specific varieties? Because is that subtle difference that you're tasting at the new make level, does it actually even translate to the whiskey itself? And when I say undoubtedly there is a difference between, one variety of barley, say Laureate, which is a very malty, off the still, it's very, very malty, compared to Concerta, which is very, very light and fruity. Absolutely there's a difference when you taste it off the still. But if you put 2 3-year-old bourbon barrels in front of me that have been matured with different barley varieties, we've actually sent out tasting packs to people where this has been new make spirits, and there's been 3 or 4 different new make spirits from different barley varieties, and also yeast varieties. Anyway, but you can absolutely taste the flavor. But then 3 years in a fairly light touch barrel, like a bourbon barrel, and you probably, most of that flavor that you've got off the stills, in terms of the difference, most of that difference you've got in terms of the flavor off the stills, has probably been surpassed by the unique influence of each barrel. So I think the whole debate around barley and its influence on whiskey, you have to first kind of figure out in your brain and for specific whiskies where it ranks in terms of the influence. And I think that's why brewers, for example, talk about it much more than distillers do, because beer has less influences on it and you're closer to the barley with the beer than you are with the distilled spirit. And then you're even further away when you're talking about a distilled spirit that's matured in a multitude of different casks.
Okay. So,
But it's
okay,
still,
yeah.
but regardless of saying that, ultimately we're a single malt distillery that wants to focus on flavor and wants to examine it. And so any impact on that flavor is worth us being conscious of and informing our processes.
Yeah, just on that, Josh, I think that
Yeah.
James made a really good point there. There's because of the way, I mean, we're all, there are similarities between the distilleries on this call, so they're, we'll have probably quite similar views on some stuff. But we, as Lochlea Distillery, because we have that story around the barley and it all being grown on site, we then try and translate that in other ways throughout the process into the flavor of our new make. So one of the big things that John insists on is actually not having a completely clear wort, because yes, that will give you more fruit, but actually if you rake that mash tun a couple of times, you're going to get more of the cereal character. So we actually want that. We want that flavor to come through in the final spirit. Because that's part of our story. We if people are come and see the massive grain shed at the distillery, which I hope you guys will at some point soon, and then you get handed a glass and you make, psychologically you're staring at a big pile of barley and you're going to go, oh, that's cereal notes really coming through here. I mean that's part of it forms part of the story. So I think I can totally understand why the big guys don't talk about terroir, because it does not fit their narrative. If you buy all of your barley at as low a price as you can for as high a yield as you can, you don't want to tell a story about the flavour impact of barley. Whereas with the scale that we're at and the way that we're trying to do things quite different, it's interesting. That's why this call is happening. It's interesting to talk about, see different people's view.
So earlier on, David Thompson, you had talked about the idea of spring barley, and so I know there's spring barley and there's winter barley, and over the years there have been a few distilleries that kind of highlighted that idea of this whiskey is made from spring or winter barley, and I'm curious from a farming perspective, what are those different seasons doing to the barley, and how is it affecting your production? Maybe not even just from a flavor standpoint, but does it affect your the parts of the process?
I've just got to say, actually, I've missed 10 minutes because the internet went down. So if I repeat anything that other guys have said, I apologise. But yeah, it's a really interesting subject, and my background is I went to university and studied crop science and spent 15 years in the industry buying and selling malting barley, and then latterly with my business partner Tom and his farm. So I've seen a lot of change in farming practices and choice of variety. Pretty much 40 years ago, we were all growing winter barleys, and winter barleys by nature are sown in the winter, and they go through an element of dormancy before they start to grow, and then they're going into winter with quite a reasonable green growth, and then in the spring they're just waiting to go. So very much different to a spring sown crop, which goes in the ground sort of early in the spring, just now really, and it has to get going very, very quickly. So the influence on a spring barley of the weather is very much more sort of important, really, because if you've got a dry spring, you're not going to get a great establishment of the crop, and it's sometimes a little bit of a battle. Somebody asked me the other day, what would happen if you grew a winter variety that in the spring? And fundamentally, their characteristics are very different. So winter barley needs an element of dormancy before it starts to grow. So effectively, you'd get a very poor crop establishment. and they are specifically bred for the times of year when they're actually planted. So yeah, it's interesting. When we choose varieties that suit our land, I mean that's the bottom line. We know what works well. We know what varieties have always grown well. 40 years ago, there were varieties where if you stood in a field of barley, it would be up to my shoulder almost. Now they're very, very short. They're sort of up to your kneecaps, perhaps. So over the years, that they've developed and bred varieties really to stand the weather of time and conditions, and that's been the focus on plant breeding. As far as I'm aware, at no time has anybody bred a variety for flavour. It's very much to do with growing characteristics, disease resistance, and so on. So yeah, I've seen a lot of change, and I would suggest now we're 85% spring sown and very, very little winter sown. So yeah, it's changed.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so with sowing in mind, David Ferguson, I know that Lochlea, you've got you have your first release, which is about to hit U.S. shores, but then you also have the Sowers release. Hopefully, I have that name right.
Sowing edition. Yeah,
Sowing edition. That's it. So can you talk about the story behind that particular bottling?
Yeah, of course. I mean, basically, and actually, that's what's in my glass right now. But that is the first of 4 seasonal batches that we're doing. So it's kind of, in terms of this conversation, what we've tried to do is showcase the Lochlea spirit in a few different ways, but actually link it into what's happening on the farm. So with the Sowing edition, the first crop of that is this year. It's sold out everywhere else, but it'll be in the US very soon. And that one is first of all bourbon, so it kind of lets the Lochlea character really shine through. It also is probably the best. So if we're talking about a sort of Waterford style, everything else staying the same, but the barley changing, then actually, if you grab a bottle of this year and then get one of the second crop at the same time next year, those will be the exact same process in every way, other than it's 2021 barley versus 2022. So that actually will be quite a good. I wish I had both right now, because I could do a bit of a test. So that's the way that we've structured. I mean, we've not structured our entire release plan around this call, but it fits quite nicely into what we're talking about.
Little did the viewers know, we based this entire call around the Sowers edition. So there was a question that came in from Graham Fraser a bit earlier on that I want to get to, but it goes into, and it actually ties in really well to a question that I know Sam and I had been discussing, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But seeing as we're talking about the farming process, and we'll get back to the farming process, because David Thompson, I know you have a lot to share there. So I've got a very specific question for you. But from Travis Williams, he wants to know if you rotate your crops from season to season, and if so, do you notice the differences in the same barley type that is grown in different fields or locations on your farm? So I guess it's to that terroir kind of idea of, can you notice differences even from one field to the next? So I'll let you guys fight for who wants to answer that first.
Well, I can give you an answer on that. I mean, I think this feeds into the whole idea of I think you have to understand the difference between, talking about terroir, because I don't think I would agree with David Thompson in terms of, like, terroir for us when it comes to barley isn't really a factor. Well, certainly not when it comes to Kilchoman, because you don't have different terroir on a farm. Terroir is the same thing grown in different locations, and that difference in location having a factor on the whiskey. So there is no terroir with Kilchoman, and as I understand it, there wouldn't be necessarily terroir in terms of my understanding of the definition of terroir for Lochlea or for Spirit of Yorkshire. You know, we're for Kilchoman, we're talking about different varieties influencing the flavour of the whiskey. So you know, we shouldn't really even mention the word terroir in talking about Kilchoman, although it's a lovely word, so it gets thrown around, doesn't it? So yeah, but in terms of like different things tasting differently because of they're grown in different fields, you know, I am very nervous about saying anything about farming because David Thompson is obviously a complete expert, and I have about 4.5 hours of tractor time in my entire life. So but you know, last year we had a very dry summer on Islay, and we have quite heavy fields, you know, in terms of the soil. We have quite light fields in terms of the soil, and most years when it's like a horizontal rain that is typical of the Islay summer, you know, unlike a typical year, we had quite a dry summer and particularly a dry harvesting period. So the yields off our heavier fields were better than our lighter fields for the first time virtually ever. And, you know, we, for the first time in 10 years, we had a yield over 2 tons per acre, you know, which is absolutely record breaking for us, but would be, you know, I would have thought down in Yorkshire, if they got anything less than 2 tons an acre, they'd be drinking themselves or drinking the pub dry in misery. Yeah, I mean, the different fields in terms of rotation and the influence, you know, those are 2 different questions, I guess. So in terms of, you know, yeah, in any given year, one field might do better than another at Kilchoman. But in terms of the flavour from different fields, essentially, that's not something you should focus much of your energy on when you're talking about your whiskey.
There you go. I see some knowing smiles here from the Davids. Do you guys agree?
I don't want to be too. I'm aware that sometimes I'm very deliberate and black and white, and maybe that doesn't leave a lot of room for chit chat. But that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just chip in and then let David actually talk sense. But I mean, from our point of view, yeah, the you know, field to field, we would never be able to tell that difference because all of our barley comes from, I mean, the 222 acres, and then it's in the same, you know, it's in the same shed. So we don't sit, you know, you'd have to, I suppose, separate out individual batches, and which would just be a logistical nightmare. So no, I don't see there being a huge difference between different parts of the farm.
Okay. Yeah, and I think taking that to its extent as well, it's not just the batch of barley, it's all your feints and foreshots from field 1. You know, where do they go? So that if you understand farming and distilling, there's sort of a lot of questions to be asked of, if you've got 9 releases all from different fields, where do you put the feints and foreshots, and how, and you guys will know, you've got to run 2 or 3 washes before you get enough feints and foreshots and low wines to get your first spirit run going. So economically, it's just not viable to completely separate fields of barley. And if you do pick up a small difference in flavour profile by doing that, again, I'll be extremely surprised, because every year is different, every conditions are different, and I think farmers just don't grow barley like that. so yeah, it's more of a practical way of thinking about barley farming, and farmers are really just picking a variety that is going to do well on their soil type, knowing their soil type as they do, and their growing conditions. You know, we're near the coast, we get a difference of growing condition to somebody more inland. So all these factors go into the choice of variety, but not because you're trying to drive a flavour profile through it.
Okay. These are brilliant answers, and I love that, David. I'll talk, and then I'll let David Thompson talk sense. So that was that was. David Thompson, I've got a question specifically for you. This is a question that Sam and I have been discussing, and everybody's mentioned it. You've got quite an educational background in crop science. You used a term that I don't know if I could repeat again, agro something, and it sounds better than crop science, but I'm going to use crop science. But I wonder, with all with all the education that you've had, how is that translated into your farming and then further on into production beyond what we've already discussed?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we've always got to look at ways of protecting the soil. The soil is the bread and butter for us guys. And, over the years, we've seen soil erosion. We've seen, certainly in America, there's a real problem with soil erosion. And we're turning now to protecting the soil for future generations. And on our farm, what we're doing is no cultivation at all. So the beauty of not cultivating the soil is that you're not actually releasing carbon to the atmosphere, first and foremost. The soil structure is left alone. Your worm population increases, your dry matter increases, percentage increases, which gives more water retention. So in the drier years, which we're absolutely going to get going forward, we want that dry matter to be at highest possible concentration as we can be. We're also now with spring cropping, we're able to sow cover crops between harvest and sowing. And those cover crops are carefully selected plants to do different things to the soil. So we've got clovers in there that are fixing natural nitrogen. We've got tap roots from radishes that are breaking up the soil structure and aerating it. We've got Phacelia, which fixes carbon back into the soil, sequesters carbon from the atmosphere. So all of these sorts of farming practices of I would like to say developed, but actually it's probably going back to how they were, hundreds of years ago before modern mechanical tilling was done. So we're embracing that side of things because we know that the soil needs that love and care for the next generations. And I think that's definitely something that is probably more important than talking about flavour and varieties at the moment. It's incredibly important that we actually have the soil there to grow the crop in the first place.
That's brilliant. What you're talking about reminds me a bit of James, something I think you mentioned to me last year, I want to say, where you were doing some work in your own fields to basically gain access to more of your own land, to sow more of your own barley. I wonder if you could talk about that. It seems kind of apropos to what David was saying.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, so we farm about 2,000 acres, to just over 2,000 acres, but most of that ground is certainly not suitable for growing barley. It barely grows a sort of dry lump of heather, so it wouldn't be very suitable for growing barley. So yeah, we farm a fairly large area, but only about 200 acres at the moment, probably 200 to 220 acres of that 2,000 acres is suitable for growing barley. We do have some pasture which is fairly waterlogged. There's too much moisture in the soil, so we have been going through a program of drainage. So we're draining about another 100 acres of fields to bring into barley. Probably next year, hopefully next year, and that should increase our overall ability to grow barley. How much barley exactly we grow is hard to say until we actually put until we actually harvest it, but it should increase our total barley growing capacity by about 30%. So we should be able to grow about 450 tons roughly by next year. You can drain the fields and put in more barley, but then ultimately you have to increase everything down the chain as well. So malting floor is extending and kiln adaptations to the kiln and more barley storage on site and everything else. So it's so we're doing all that, and it's all going to plan at the moment. It is a slightly different, it's not quite as simple as sort of draining the fields and then sticking in some barley. There is a bit more that goes on as well as that. But yeah, I mean, interestingly, I was very interested to hear about the cultivating that David Thompson was talking about. And I'm probably really outing myself as a distiller rather than a farmer, but the cultivating part of it, you were talking about moving away from cultivation in terms of like actually direct sowing into the ground rather than ploughing and I think that's an area we're looking at, but I would be interested to pick his brain on that, but maybe it's not the right place.
Yeah, I mean, we're only sort of 4 years into it now, so it's a big change to our farm. But there's no doubt we are now seeing the yields did drop, in the first couple of years, but they're definitely back to where they were.
Does weather when you're sowing play a huge role in how that crop ends up?
We're on the east coast, you're on the west coast, so we don't get the moisture you guys get. So the beauty of the Wolds land. I mean, the Wolds are the area that we farm, which are very chalky. It's calcareous soil, very free draining, which is perfect for barley. So we don't actually get problems at sowing times per se. We wait a couple of days, it's dry again. So we don't have that battle. But you don't grow barley on heavy land that's wet anyway. It's just not suitable for that sort of land. You'd grow a wheat crop or something that's high protein. The other, I don't know if we talked about protein and nitrogen as well, content, which is critically important when you're buying barley. So the malts will all specify a low nitrogen barley. So effectively, you need a relatively infertile soil to produce low nitrogen barley and very reduced inputs. So you'd never grow it on a field that's very fertile, very heavy. That's very much more of a wheat soil for growing really heavy crops. So it's really important the type of soil you're growing barley on, and certainly free draining helps.
This is all brilliant. I'm learning so much here. I'm glad you asked that question, James. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here, and James, you touched on it briefly, and this ties in perfectly to the question that Graham Fraser had, and the question that Sam had, and we'd been discussing earlier. So it has to do with malting floors, and obviously it's a huge investment to a distillery, and David Ferguson, I if I'm understanding correctly, you may be looking at doing your own malting floors. I may have that information right or not right, but I guess my question is, what importance does that malting floor have for you? Is it merely cost savings? Is it to ensure quality? What are the benefits to having a malt floor versus not having a malt floor? Are there benefits to having industrial maltings versus floor maltings? So, maybe we'll start with James, and then we'll kick it over to David Ferguson, and then David Thompson.
I think so I'll talk about it in terms of Kilchoman and Islay, because Islay, has a unique economy, and there are things available on the mainland which just aren't available on Islay. And the key decision for Kilchoman is, if we grow it ourselves, we have control over the maltings. So we have control over where the peat, particularly the peat, because effectively malting your barley is the process of maximizing the starch and the fermentable sugars. That's really the process. So it's, you do it well and you'll end up with lots of whiskey, and you do it badly, you won't end up with very much. But away from that, when you're talking about a peated single malt, as all Kilchomans are, peat is the key flavor component, and different peat, mainland peat and Islay peat, give a different smoke and a different flavor to the malt. So the key thing for us is that we use Islay peat, and so the only two options that you have available as an Islay distillery are that you either malt it yourselves or you buy from the Port Ellen maltings on Islay. Those are the only two options you have if you want to buy a barley that's peated using Islay peat. You can, I believe there are other options, but those essentially are your if you're talking about, reasonable volumes, those are your options. So the Port Ellen maltings has reached capacity about 10 years ago. So you won't be able to get any, Isla peated barley from them. And so you have to do it yourselves. And so that's what we do. And, we have traditional floor maltings, which are an enormous pain in the ass, because you basically sort of quadruple handle barley. You're shoveling it for you put it in and out of a wheelbarrow about 3 or 4 times, really, throughout the malting process. And, many people would say that that's unnecessary because, traditional floor maltings, while it looks very pretty and it's very much a handcrafted way of doing it in terms of flavor, it's probably minimal. Well, I would say it's probably non-existent. It's in terms of when you're drinking it, a 10-year-old whiskey. But for us, it's part ethos of the distillery. Part the decision to go down the traditional floor maltings was part ethos and part the amount of barley that we have to process. When we first started, we were only processing about 100 to 200 tons of barley in a year. So it wouldn't make sense to put in a commercial maltings, big drum or otherwise maltings. So we started off as this traditional floor maltings. But now that we're going to be processing 450 tons, we might look at it differently. Were we to start from today, we might well look at a commercial, drum maltings, and actually, similar to Lochlea, we are looking at putting in a separate commercial maltings because we foresee issues with supply from Port Ellen. And then there's the other element that ultimately you kind of, as with David Thompson and David Ferguson, we're distilleries that like to control different aspects of production, so having that control over the maltings is important to us. And I would just add that malting it does not get the credit that it deserves in terms of the complexity. It is a hugely complex, perhaps even more complex than distilling. The influence of the environment and the changing, you have to adapt the processes every single day of the year. No single day of the year, you malt in the same way. So it's a very, very complicated process. And we took 10 years to get it right. We honestly did. We're not the brightest, but, it still took 10 years. It's a very, very complex process. But ultimately, we put in a floor maltings because of the scale, but also because we wanted to peat using Isla peat.
So just really quickly, David, I'll get to you in just 1 second. Just really quickly, if the malting process is so complex and difficult to maintain or anticipate, what's the final verdict to when that barley is properly malted? Is that the result where you just it could take 2 days, it could take 5 days? What are the variables that you're discussing here?
So the variables in terms of the traditional floor malting processes, so steeping, temperature of the water, so over the course of the year, so during the steeping process, you've got, for us it's 48 hours, and you have periods where it's soaked in water, and then periods where it's dried and aerated, and for us that varies between 8 and 12 hours, from wet to dry. Depending on the temperature of the water, the time of year, when it's first spread on the malt floor, the thickness when it first goes down will vary from 40 to 50 centimeters deep to 15 to 20 centimeters deep, and everything in between. And then as you go from a thick bed to a thin bed, you need to ensure that the barley remains oxygenated, but we also need to ensure that there's an even temperature, and you also need to and to do that, you need to gradually spread it out whilst not losing heat, and in the colder months, but then in the hotter months, you need to ensure that you do get rid of that heat. So it's I can totally understand why people go down the commercial route in terms of, you know, sending their barley to commercial maltings to do it, because that's what they do, you know. And as I said, you know, when you're particularly talking about an unpeated whiskey, you know, that impact on the flavor is fairly minimal. But, you know, again, Islay is an island 30 miles off mainland Scotland. So if we're using Islay barley, we need to put it onto a lorry, drive it probably to, you know, somewhere in central Scotland to have it malted, and then put back onto that lorry and brought back to Islay. And, you know, the practicalities of that are challenging. So, you know, it's not something that we really are considering or ever have.
Okay. So at David Ferguson, we've heard pros and we've heard cons for malt, for your own floor maltings, and then also for industrial. Can you talk to us about what Lochlea's looking to do?
Yeah, so no, James is absolutely right. The capital investment is different to just sort of using a third party. You need more people, space. So when I spoke to Alison, our finance director, about it, she said, "Why the hell are you even considering this?" Actually, the reason that we're doing it, there's a couple of reasons, but the main one is that we want a spirit, a new make that has body to it. We're not trying to create a light, delicate floral lowland. That's not what Lochlea is at all. So we want body to the spirit. One way of getting more body from the oils from the barley is to floor malt traditionally. John has done it at Lefroy, you know, 20% of their, excuse me, 20% of theirs was floor malted, and actually that 20% is probably bigger than what we will need for the entire production at Lochlea. But he's quite confident. One thing that we're blessed with is space. We know exactly where it's going to go, so we're going to run a trial next month when the temperature's right, and then if that goes to plan, then yeah, we'll do it ourselves. And I think it's similar to what the other guys have said, but because of the scale that we are, taking control of these things is a bit easy. You know, if you are a Lefroy, you can't just say, right, we're going to malt 100% of our, you know, it's not economical. For us, we don't want to, we've not cut corners at any point getting to this stage. So right now to then say, right, we'll just, you know, we'll keep outsourcing that part, it just doesn't feel right. The other big thing for us as a business is that it's the only thing that goes off site right now, which, you know, for me, if I'm taking people around and saying, here's the fields, here's the barley, here's, you know, everything's all matured on site, all made here. Oh, but by the way, it goes, you know, half an hour that way and comes back malted. It's just like, you know, in terms of our story and from a, you know, carbon footprint point of view, it's the only thing that leaves the site right now. So if we can have that truck not coming on and off and save a bit more energy, then great, because everything else, our reed-bed system and our draft goes next door, and it all stays around the farm. It's not. So this will be another thing that we have control over, and we'll hopefully add a bit more body to the new make, which is so the main thing is quality of spirit. And that's what we're, you know, what everything is about here. So it doesn't necessarily make sense on a spreadsheet, but actually for what's important to us, it does.
So is the aim to do 100% of your barley needs floor malted in-house?
Yep, 100%.
Wow. Okay.
How much barley is that? Sorry, I know I'm not the compare.
How much barley do we use in a year?
Yeah.
So we've got a good question. So we've got a 2-ton mash, and we're doing 1 mash per day, 5 days, 480, 500 tons, something around that. So yeah,
you should come to Kilchoman and have a look. We'll tell you how not to do it.
Yeah,
and give you a good idea.
Yeah, no, but I mean, this trial. So the reason I'm not sounding up, you know, but it's not 100% until the trial's gone right. If the trial goes horribly wrong next month, then I'll need to try and erase this call off of YouTube.
How do you do a trial? You're putting it in a wheelbarrow and with a hose pipe and then spreading it on a.
It's very agricultural, James.
Yeah, I love agricultural. Give me all the horrible details.
we've got a plan. So actually, Neil, the owner who owns the farm, runs the site and everything. We've kind of raided the workshop and the buyer for various tools that we will use as a one-off, just to see if things work. I mean, it's actually more so to check that the space is right and the floor and everything, and then that will go. We'll do 1 week's production using that, which will be interesting to bring out in a few years' time.
And Mr. Thompson, do you think floor maltings is in the future for Spirit of Yorkshire, or are you happy sending your barley out to be malted elsewhere?
Never say never is what I'd say. But as I said before, the Wolds are a fantastic area for growing malting barley, and we have two of the biggest malting businesses just around us for that reason. So literally, I mean, I think David was saying 30 minutes down the road. We're probably 5 minutes down the road. So it's tempting to have a go, but it is very, very useful to be able to send 200 tons away and have it straight back as a uniform malted product from an expert, I would say. And at the moment that works for us, but never say never. You know, we're always willing to have a go. And David also said that it's the only thing that leaves the farm, and it's exactly the same with us. You know, we've got everything on the farm apart from the malting process. So it would be nice, but it's a very energy hungry process. And if you get it wrong, even more so. So I think at the moment we're happy for the experts to do it for us, and we get our barley back. It's ring fence for us. We know where it's come from and how it's been processed, and that gives us a really good canvas for building blocks of flavour following that.
As an English whiskey producer, do you dabble in peated barley? Is that something that even makes sense from your own stylistic standpoint?
That's a great question. I mean, again, the same business that we get our unpeated barley from, I put a peating plant in Yorkshire, but it's a little bit ironic because they bring peat down from Scotland. So in terms of food miles and carbon footprint, it doesn't really add up for us. But we've never really set out to make a peated product. I think if we could probably find a bit of Yorkshire peat, we'd have a go, but it's not our sort of future, I don't think, at this time.
Got it. There was a question that Mark Stewart Cassidy had that really ties into a question that I've had in the chamber. However, as per usual, I take up all of the airtime when I watch Sam and Chris there that may want to say something, whether it's a question or whatnot. So I'm going to take a pause and to sip and hand it over to Sam or Chris if you wanted to chime in.
Thank you, Joshua. Just wanted to make sure that you know, and I'm sorry I didn't let you know before, that Lochlea first edition or US inaugural edition or inaugural release and Sowing edition come at the same time. So originally it was one after another, but thanks to us not being able to find the vessel for the first edition, Sowing edition comes with that.
Are you thanking global supply?
I need to find something positive out of this. We need to find something positive. Otherwise, we're going to hang ourselves on our own road.
You ain't going to find me thinking global supply issues right now. It's shipping issue. I just think it's fascinating. There's so many moving parts. Like you come in thinking you're going to talk about varietals, and within the first 5 minutes, you realize it's 75 different variables from the beginning to the end, right? Simply what you guys were talking about, malting alone, seems like it's almost impossible to narrow it down to one thing, simply because it just doesn't fit. Like the one puzzle piece doesn't fit everyone's puzzle board. That makes sense. So I'm still wrapping my head around all of it.
Yeah, I think it kind of ties what you're saying, Chris, into a conversation that I was having with David Ferguson and John Campbell, and of course with Jason for One Nation Under Whiskey podcast, where we said, what happens if you make this one tiny change in your process, and it changes everything. So these little variables that seem just that little make such a difference. And for me, it's just hearing about the massive number of variables that I didn't even know existed.
Just an example of that, Joshua, you've hit on something there. So John, when he first joined us, went through, he measures everything. 26 years doing every job at Lefroy, he just knows everything. So he measures everything. And one of the first things he did was changed, and this is going back to my cynical nature, I thought this will not make a blind bit of difference. He changed the speed that we run our wash still, and the new mate was totally was just infinitely better straight. And I was like, this is like, there are so, I've done my IBD and all the rest of it years ago, and you think you know every variable, or at least the main 5 or 6 things that you tweak to get a new make style. But there are just, Chris is right. There's so many things, and the way we've tried to play that back is, what do we want at the end? What do we want Lochlea to be as a new make spirit, and then work backwards and say, right, what does that then mean for fermentation? How long? What does it mean for yeast strain? Okay, we're using 2 different types now. Excuse me. So yeah, these just, you're right. There's infinite number of things that can change, and that's what makes it interesting. That's why we could spend another few hours on this call, I'm sure.
My follow-up to that would be, you guys haven't talked about this, but do you guys have any type of intent as far as documentation goes of how many different variables worked and didn't work over the course of the distillery's evolution? So like James, for you, it would be rainfall versus the way that way Macro Bay appeared for, versus rainfall when that batch would have been distilled from, no plans whatsoever.
You've met my father, haven't you? I don't think he's not a big detail man necessarily. No, I think it's the trouble with, or not the trouble, but the challenge that a lot of whiskey enthusiasts face is that they get really into it. They get really into the detail, and they want to know everything. They want to know absolutely everything. They want to know what field it was grown in, what the rainfall was like that year, and everything else. And that's all important information, and it's information we're willing to share and willing to talk about. The challenge for everyone is putting it in its appropriate slot in terms of its importance and the flavor of the whiskey, and we do record a lot of information, far more information than perhaps others. But that doesn't extend to. We did put up a weather station one time. It lasted about 8 months, and then it fell over because it just got blown flat. It's the detail is important, and we look at the detail just as much as anyone else. But I think it's all, and what Joshua was saying about, you change one little bit and then it has all these knock-on effects. I think that's kind of part and parcel with being a distiller, being a whiskey distiller and also being a farmer. There are so many moving parts. I think the comfort you can take in a distiller, from the distiller's perspective, is that it all ends up in the same place in terms of it all ends up in a barrel, and that's you can take comfort in that, because I'd feel a little bit naked making big changes to the yeast variety and cut points, still barley, everything else. I'd feel quite naked if we were producing a white spirit, an unmatured spirit. But because it all kind of goes in the barrel, and the barrel and the age are the dominating factors, you can kind of fall back on that and pull the flavors together and combine those different flavors from different years, in the warehouse, different cask types, and you can work out those details when you end up putting, when you put together actual whiskey in the bottle. So it's a challenge from all perspectives, but when you go into the warehouse and you start pulling stuff out of the casks, it all kind of gets a little bit more clear.
Let me
there
chime in
was
for a second here.
yeah,
I know
please.
that your break is almost over there. Joshua, you took what, 90-second break? So
It's
I got
okay.
a few more minutes. So
Thank you,
I
sir.
am actually, this is kind of strange, but I am now drinking the 25-year-old single cask Ben Nevis. The label, for whatever reason, shows like a barley feel, or maybe it's a heather feel, something. I'm sure that was distilled when I started my career in spirits industry, and I'm sure at that time no one thought, or I hope, or 99% sure that no one thought about what kind of barley is going to influence the taste of this, and etc. And now we're sitting and talking about how much barley is playing the role of what the whiskey comes. And I think, James, you were the one who opened my eyes in, it was 2012 when we went to the distillery and you poured this new make that came right off the still. And I was so shocked by its purity, and I enjoyed drinking it like this without even any wood influence. It was very citrusy and then David Ferguson sent me this, which is a Lochlea new make.
Oh,
And David
lucky.
Thompson, you owe us a new make there, white dog, whatever you can call it. And you get this
Absolutely.
nice kind of heathery, maybe veggie, a little bit of a earthy feel, a cereal feel, which is great. That you always want to make sure the wood is not going to cover this. It's not going to spoil it. So I think more and more people now realize how much barley plays the role. We do a number of tastings, and I never remember anyone asking anything about barley. It was more like wood influence, sherry cask, bourbon casks, first fill, second fill. Lately, I would say 1 out of 5 people that approach the table would start talking about barley. So I think this conversation we're having today is very, very important, and it has a huge potential.
Brilliant. I am I'm dying of FOMO here, given you have that Lochlea new make. And
I'll share with
look
you.
at
I
that.
promise.
Yeah, upload it. Thank you. I'll get the app for that. So there was a question that came through from Mark Stewart Cassidy that tied into my question a little bit, and we started touching on it when we were discussing yeast. So here we go. So do you think yeast variety would, should, or could influence the choice of barley that you're using in fermentation in your whiskey production, and vice versa? And then just, back to Mark, as an extension to that question is, do different barleys ferment at different rates? So David Thompson, why don't you take that one if you don't mind?
In our experience, different varieties don't ferment at different rates. It's very much to do with process again. So how you've mashed in, the temperature you've used, whether you go for a clear wort or a slightly cloudy wort. All these things are adding different profiles. Yeasts are incredibly important. As you know, we're involved with Jim Swan in the early days, and he spent a huge amount of time with us selecting the right yeast varieties and strains to drive the flavour profile we were looking for. And we ended up with two strains, one that was more to do with production of alcohol, and the other one was very much to do with production of the esters that were going to be in the wash to distill out on the fruity side of the scale. And it's incredibly important to get that right. We haven't played with that, because I think once you've set your stall out and going about talking about what you change and when you change it, if you do something, just do one thing. Don't do lots of things and see what influence that has in your particular circumstance. So when we do tweak things, it is just the one thing at a time, and just see how that influences the character of the product. But yeah, yeast, you can't underestimate how important it is to have the right yeast strains doing the right job in your particular distillery.
But would you would the yeast that you are using help you to determine what type of barley you're looking to plant?
Again, we're coming back to varietals, and varietals
Yeah.
for us are very much to do with agronomics. It's not to do with flavour for us. Coming from a lot of years of growing barley, we still don't believe a variety has an influence on flavour. We believe that the process is the influence on flavour. So no would be the answer to that in my experience.
In your experience, okay. Chris.
What is the hierarchy of the determining factors of the agronomics? Is it humidity, the chemical composition of the soil, or the wind, or what? Like when you're choosing, what is paramount and then what follows?
Very much climate and soil type. So climate and soil type would influence, because if you look at how they've bred varieties of barley, the focus is on its natural disease resistance, how tall it grows. It's some varieties are not recommended for distilling and brewing, and some are both. And it's about whether it's high diastatic barley, so it's got a lot of enzymes with it or not. So varieties are very much bred for process, and there's never been a column for flavour. So when you're selecting varieties, you're selecting it for what suits my soil type, my environment, and fundamentally as well, and quite importantly, what the maltster will take. He doesn't want 50 varieties of barley. He wants 3 or 4 varieties, so he gets uniformity in the process. So I think that's really important, that you're growing the crop that people want to buy if you're a farmer, not a distiller. And I think very much it's led by that quite often as well.
That's a wild idea that I haven't even considered. How does the barley that you grow has to work with your third-party maltster? That's wild, James.
I think something just to jump in there. I think something that people forget is that farmers are not interested in distilling. Farmers grow barley or plant or sow particularly varieties of barley because they get paid per ton of barley that they're selling to the malting houses. They don't get paid for anything else. They get paid by the ton, provided it meets certain parameters. So then they're not interested. So unless you take control of those aspects of production, then you're not going to be able to influence it. So
okay, that's different perspective completely.
And people talk about old barley varieties, and David Thompson will be able to tell you much more about this. But the whole idea of barley varieties, essentially, people talk about golden promise a lot. To me, do you grow golden promise? And I have a good friend who's a seed merchant, and the whole evolution of barley varieties is quite a fascinating topic in itself. And you've got to remember that all these things are driven by farmers. They're not driven by malting houses, not by distilleries. Distilleries, Diageo will buy vast quantities of barley, and they don't give a damn what barley variety it is. They really don't. They'll take, provided it meets the malting parameters and everything else. They'll take whatever the farmers are growing. And
I think going back to your golden promise, and I talked right early on about the height of the barley. Golden promise was up to your shoulders. So, if you had a bad harvest or a bad conditions, or it was windy and wet, you'd lose the whole crop. And also over time, they lose their ability to naturally be disease resistant. So that breaks down over time naturally. So they're continually choosing varieties and breeding them to be more resistant to disease. So just because it's old doesn't mean it's better. In fact, it means it's probably broken down in lots of ways, but it might have one characteristic that you can carry through to the next variety, which was very positive. So that's the breeding art, if you like, is carrying the best parts of each variety through to the next varieties to come down the road.
Okay.
Yeah, from our perspective, Joshua, with let's go back to the question around what determines one or the other. We only, it's definitely the other way around. So it's definitely we select yeast strains based on we use our own barley, so that won't change. So we've actually done a few yeast experiments recently. Excuse me, and some were really good. Others were okay, and we're not going to change something if it's just okay. So we've actually switched a little bit recently and changed to 2 different yeasts, but they work well with whatever is coming from our own barley. So I guess we would have to buy in from other people to do a proper empirical study on the 2. But yeah, it's definitely the other way around for us.
Okay.
I mean, for us, me and David Thompson probably disagree on one key element in that. I'm saying that barley varieties do have an influence on flavour, and I think David's saying that's not the case, or certainly not to a great extent. So there being a difference between barley varieties in our case, we will pair that up to a particular yeast variety. We have a base yeast variety that we use pretty much 90, well, not quite as much as 90, but probably 80 to 85% of the year. And then for the rest of the 15% of the year, we'll kind of experiment with different yeast varieties, and that typically coincides with also when we are distilling the smaller portion of the varieties that we grow in that year. So we grow 2 varieties, and most of it is one variety, and then the smaller portion of it is a separate variety. And when we're distilling that separate variety, we also typically play around with the yeasts actually at the same time, just to see what happens. So you wouldn't necessarily pair up a heavier variety of malt like Laureate. Laureate was quite malty, quite heavy in terms of the spirit. You wouldn't necessarily pair that up with a very light a yeast variety that drives fruity light flavors. So we use Maori yeast and Kerry yeast. Those are just 2 brands, but dried Kerry yeast is very light, very floral, lots of esters, lots of fruit, lots of very citrusy flavors. And you wouldn't distill, or you wouldn't ferment Laureate with Kerry yeast. You'd probably use a Maori yeast that kind of maybe just plays on that maltier side a little bit more. But again, that's not what Kilchoman is. Kilchoman is kind of 50 ppm malted barley that we buy from Port Ellen, and it's Maori yeast, and that's what, when people pick up a glass of Kilchoman and go, well, that's Kilchoman, that's what they're tasting. If I gave them an unpeated, Kerry yeast Kilchoman, they would never think it was a Kilchoman. I don't know what point I'm making with that, but I got there somewhere.
It sounded
the
great.
End.
You get there.
Excellent, James. Well done.
There's another question that I want to get to in a minute, but James, I want to stick on this just for a little bit, because you talked about playing around with different varieties of yeast based on the different varieties of barley that you're growing. So around 20% of your overall production has these tests. But are you running these tests both on your own barley and the Port Ellen Maltings barley that you get in?
Yeah. We'll do. We'll use different yeast varieties. We have a schedule for production. So and we have 2 sides to our still house. So we have 2 sets of stills, and we have on the sort of newer side of our still house, we built in some abilities to define the cutoffs between different batches. So we have basically a valve that we can switch off and divert the foreshots and feints and isolate them much better than we can on the old side. So we will experiment with. I mean, my dad goes through just sort of different obsessions over the course of the year. So at one time he'll be buying lots of different casks types and filling those, and then a different time of year he'll be playing around with different yeast varieties, or he's been on a call and like this, and someone has been talking about how they tried this yeast and it was fantastic, and he'll think, oh, that sounds like a good idea, and then he'll go and do that. So it's, there's no real logic to it. We just play around, and we always kind of come back to what Kilchoman always kind of was, really. We've never produced any significant quantity of spirit that wasn't how Jim Swan spec'd it out in 2005. We've pretty much used the same yeast, the same cut points, certainly the same cut points. The stills haven't changed. The fermentation time, over the course of the week, where you have a 5-day week, you have different, as opposed to a 24/7 production schedule, you have different fermentation time. So there are areas where you have slight changes in fermentation time, but the core DNA, or the core sort of way that we make our whiskey, hasn't really changed dramatically.
Okay.
But the experimentation has.
That has your experimentation. Well, I see Chris has got a question really quickly. So I've got a quick question. Chris has a question. Then I have got a final question in the chamber here. Hopefully we can stay at an hour and a half. If we go over 2 minutes, I apologize. Oh, darn it. What was I going to ask you? What did you just say?
I can't remember what I said.
Oh, geez, Louise.
Let me ask my question. Maybe it'll jog your memory.
Maybe I'll remember it. Yeah.
James, you talked about how you and David might disagree on one point, but I don't necessarily know if that's true. And the reason why I would say that is, my question is for both of you. If you change the barley varietal and you don't change the process to accommodate the new varietal, would you get a different flavor from it? Does that make sense? So like David, yours is honed in based on what you're currently growing. If you put in a new one, would you have to change it at all? And if you didn't change what you were doing, would you get the exact same flavor, or would it switch because of inefficiencies of the process? So you're not necessarily doing the best process for the barley that you put on.
Sure. I mean, we grow 2 spring varieties, Concerto and Laureate, and we actually grow a winter variety called Vessel. And we haven't changed the processes at all. So we use the same yeast, the same process all the way through. And we're not seeing, in terms of a style of spirit, any discernible difference. So, we do get differences because of the conditions when you're distilling. I mean, the atmospheric pressures and all of these sorts of things have a massive influence as well. And this is my point. There's lots of variables naturally. We're producing a natural product at the end of the day. And the influence on the cask is one of those unknown things to an extent. But in terms of the new make spirit, we don't really pick up anything different from using a different variety. Do
you harvest and the varieties as a single harvest, and they're stored and malted as a single harvest?
Yeah, well, single variety. So
okay, right. So you'll harvest the Laureate and the Concerto separately.
Separately, yeah, and they'll be malted separately.
Do the maltsters change their process based on the?
No, because we're a brewery as well. Remember, so half of our barley goes to make beer, and half of our barley goes to make whiskey. And the malting process is different. We're trying to get a very pale malt for the beer, and a slightly different process for the whiskey. So that does actually influence. One time we did actually have to dip into the malt that was malted for the beer, and that did have a difference. And that was quite a marked difference as well. So the malting process definitely has an influence on flavour.
So you see where I'm going to go with this with James. James, are you changing the way you're malting based on the varietal that you're growing?
Well, the way that we malt changes every day of the week.
But do you see what I mean? Like if you're kind of taking the same style with one that you're taking with the other, you're going to get a variation in flavor between the two because of the inefficiencies of the practice with both. Because you're doing the floor malting as opposed to the commercial maltings. And that's where you guys kind of agree, even though you don't agree, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, Yeah, yeah. I mean, in terms of the maltings, we malt in the most efficient way we can, given the atmosphere, the weather effectively that week. So yeah, I mean, essentially we get a clear difference. I'll send David Thompson some samples, and he can tell me that it was different yeast variety or something else. But yeah, we get a fairly clear difference between varieties. So
it sounds like
for
that's
whatever
the variable
reason,
though, is in the malting, is where the switches can really.
Well,
start
I
to happen.
wouldn't say so, because I wouldn't say so, because the maltings, in terms of, I wouldn't think that would be the case, because lots of things that come after the maltings have a bigger impact than whether it was raked 3 times that day or 5 times.
But varieties have different abilities to take in moisture. There is definitely a difference in varieties in terms of how they take in moisture for that process. So I think personally, I think the variety has a bigger influence on how it's malted than the variety. I mean, that every batch of variety will be different in terms of your malting.
Yeah, I mean, some varieties are more challenging to get germinating than others. Certainly, yeah.
All right, I've stirred the pot enough. Joshua, you remembered your question yet?
Your question was pretty damn close to my question, so we're good, right? Because you're talking about process and these little changes to process, right? And so if I'm being very honest, my question was to transition in a bit, was just to be a nice segue into the final question, which came in from Jeanette Daniel. And this whole time we've been talking about your various processes, and Chris, you had asked earlier about the tracking of those processes and the tracking of some of the experiments that you've done to perfect a process. And so with that in mind, we think to another distillery that's within our portfolio, and that's Ardnamurchan, and they've incorporated this blockchain technology to just basically track everything internally, and then they make it public so people can see what's going on. And so I'm curious if you're incorporating something similar, and if you are, is that something you'd ever consider following suit in? Do you think it's of value to your brand?
Who's going on that one?
I'll go. So we don't currently use blockchain. It's not. It's not something. I mean, we do track everything, and it's recorded internally. But I like. I mean, I like. I know the guys at Armark very well, so there's a vested interest there. But I like what they do. They, by making that public, I suppose one of the things we talk about as a business is being very open about everything, because we've got nothing to hide. Yeah. So me saying that, and then we don't have a blockchain, but actually it's more. I mean, blockchain's very, and I'm sure Alex would say the same. It's a very manual process to actually input everything. You have to have guys spending a lot of time administratively inputting things, and so it's not something we're looking at right now. But in future, who knows? I hope more people do move that way, whether it's blockchain or whatever the technology is. But actually being more open with consumers about what happens, because again, that for companies like the ones on this call will help us versus the bigger guys, because they'll obviously not want to do that.
And that's the beauty of single malt distilleries. We are very different in the way we operate. We produce different products, different flavor profiles, and that's what gets everybody excited about what we're doing. And I think that the openness side of it is incredibly important. And I think sometimes you can give too much information, and people can get very confused. So I think when you do put information out, it has to be, ones that does have an influence on the product they've got in the hand and what they're drinking. So and we record everything. Every single minor change or nuance will change the end product in some way or other. So I think it's important you do record everything you do.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I'd agree with both of them. I think You know, am I interested in the exact recipe of casks and the age and the the peating level and key elements like that go into the whiskey? Absolutely. Am I interested in how many times the mashman scratched his balls when he was on his shift? Not particularly.
It has to be a minimum of 3. Can we all agree it has to be a minimum of 3?
Yeah. So it's just about filtering that information to like what's relevant, what people find engaging, But ultimately, we are, as with the other guys, we're an open book, and if you go into the still house, you can ask them how many times they scratch their balls.
You can do that. I'm not doing that.
Yeah. I'm going to incorporate that into all my interviews now. Listen, we've hit the hour and a half mark. However, there's a question that came in that I think is so apropos to what the 3 of you are doing with your distilleries. And so if you wouldn't mind just sparing another 5 minutes, I'd really appreciate it. So this came in from Whiskey and Donuts, Johnny Baldray. With new distilleries popping up around the world, how much of a priority is it to be known as a farm distillery, as a farm-driven distillery?
Personally, incredibly important. Tracing back to the field where you actually planted the seed. Not many people can say that, but that has a huge impact on everything else you do following it. So I think it's incredibly important that we've got that traceability. And as long as I'm sort of farming and distilling, it will always be our barley. That 100% of our barley will go into our product, and I think that is so important. I think the other guys would agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think David mentioned traceability there, not just within the whiskey category, but I mean that's just a general trend for everything, food and drink wise. To me now, is people want to know where things originated from. And then the other side of that, which naturally by what we do on people on this call, we're far more sustainable than some of the other guys out there that don't that buy in all this stuff. So I mean, sustainability is not really a trend anymore. It's just a thing that'll be there forever. And so I think there's, just by the nature of being a farm distiller, you kind of fall into these categories. So yeah, for us, it's definitely important. I mean, it's who we are. So yeah, really important for Lochlea.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah. I mean, similarly, it's our core. That's what we put on everything is Isla's Farm Distillery. So it's central to everything we do, and I think ultimately it comes back to what's in the bottle, and what's in your glass, and how that the flavors that are in there, and if there are flavors to be had by doing things yourself, and then we'll do it, and that's really what we're about in terms of a farm distillery.
Yeah, sorry, James. Yeah, I think it's also worth saying that looking at this call, you might think that the place is awash with farm distilleries. We are still very much in the minority in terms of the distilling world. So I think it's I don't want to. I'm not trying to blow our own trumpets here, but we are quite unique in terms of, if you compare it, even within, I'm not sure exact ratio, but the English side of things, David, but in Scotland, I mean, the percentage of the 140 or so distilleries that grow their own barley, 5, 6. We're
the only English that are growing our own barley 100%. There are a couple of others that have a small proportion. But I think the other thing to bear in mind as well is, and this shouldn't be dismissed, that distilleries that don't have their own farms do contract with specific farmers, which is a really good idea. And they talk about local barley and they talk about locally produced, which is absolutely excellent. But we must bear in mind they're not farmers, so they're still asking a farmer to produce their product for them. And I think that's a step closer. But ultimately, they're not planting the seed. And I think and choosing the varieties and doing all the things that we do, knowing our soil types and how our environments are. So I think, it is unique, and it'll probably continue to be fairly unique, I would suggest.
Yeah. Most places you go, Joshua, and you see a distillery tour, the hard work's already been done by someone else. They start from right, here's the malt, and you're like, oh right, what was happened before?
Yeah.
What happened a year ago here? And whereas you come and see like our, the guys here in the call, we take you back one step further, which is the real hard work.
Yeah. Sam, was there something you wanted to add before we close the session?
Yeah, just can't stress enough how important it is for us to bring the products from farm distilleries. I know Anthony's kind of a dream was to rebuild what used to be a distillery. David Thompson, with your background and the number of years that this farm was existing, and with you, David Ferguson, of your kind of enthusiasm and importance of growing your own barley, we just couldn't be like. I know it's very difficult and it costs a lot of money and time and etc. But that's what makes us ImpEx unique, that we bring this passion of people who are behind and the story behind the distillery. So thank you very much for that.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for including us again.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us, for staying up late or setting your alarms to wake up early. And thank you to all the viewers from not just here in the U.S. There's Colin Mayers out of Australia chiming in, and I didn't see Mark Watt's name here this time around. I'll have to give him some shit later.
Thank goodness. He'd be trolling us.
But I just wanted to mention really quickly to those that are watching, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this, here at ImpEx, we're doing 3 Instagram events and then this sort of Facebook and YouTube streaming event. So the next event we'll have on Instagram will be May 11th. So just mark your calendars there. We'll start promoting that. And for those of you that are on YouTube that may not have liked our Facebook page, please check out the ImpEx Beverage Facebook page, and then vice versa. If you're on Facebook and you're not subscribed to our YouTube, then you're doing yourself a severe disservice. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Gentlemen, thank you all again for joining us. To Sam, to Chris, thank you for your questions. Sam had some questions that he sent in to me earlier that I thought were absolutely brilliant and really helped the conversation along. I learned so much, and I think our listeners did as well. So thank you all, and hopefully you can get back to sleep.
Joshua, special thanks to you for putting another great show, and James, David, to you.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.